Guys, I cannot express just how big the changes are coming. Everything you know about melees inside of Edge of Fate is about to change. A few TWABs ago, Bungie opened up with what appeared to be the largest set of nerfs we had ever seen. Not gonna lie, fellas, in that first half, your boy was about to close down the stream. I was like, dude, Bungie has lost their mind. But then, as the TWAB continued, we got to see massive buffs being laid out. But here's the thing, the way melees and our damage buffs are gonna stack in Edge of Fate is changing. And today we're gonna be diving into all the information we have in front of us, giving you pre and post values right now based on what Bungie has disclosed to us. We are gonna do our best today to accurately narrow down on these changes, to give you number values right here and now. That way you have a better idea of what is or isn't going to be better in Edge of Fate. Now, before we get into the numbers, we do need to talk about what is in fact changing. For the sake of time, this is going to be a simplified TLDR of that TWAB from a few weeks ago. With the Edge of Fate, melee damage increases are changing from multiplicative to additive. Now, to give you a rough example of what that means, let's say you have a base melee damage of 100. We are then given one damage buff, which gives it 200% increase to our melee damage. That is a 3-time multiplier, which increases our melee damage to 300. Then if we add in another damage buff, which is a 50% increase to our melee damage, that is a 1.5 times increase. In a multiplicative system, you would then first multiply the base damage, that 3 times, for that 300 total damage, as stated earlier, and then multiply it by 1.5, which would then give you 350% increase in damage, or in this case, a 4.5 times multiplier, giving us 450 total damage. In the new Edge of Fate system, all buffs will be additive. So if we take that same example of that 200% increase in damage and that 50% increase in damage, we then add those together instead of multiplying. And that would actually give us 250% increase in damage. Or in this case, a 3.5 time multiplier, spitting out a total damage of 350. So you can see why multiplicative is so much stronger with multiple stacking damage buffs, which is why in the second half of that TWID, Bungie was hitting us with a ton of major buffs to make up for this difference. Now, for those wondering, why is Bungie doing this? It's all for the sake of balance, or in this case, balance in an Armor 3.0 world. In Edge of Fate, we're gonna have 200 stats, and these things are gonna be buffing our damage, and Bungie definitely wants to make sure our builds don't get out of hand. However, Armor 3.0 is an outlier in itself. You see, Bungie will now allow stats to go all the way to 200. And if you fully spec 200 points into, say, your melee stat, this will give you a 30% increase in damage. However, this is multiplicative, and this is the only multiplicative bonus you can get for your melee damage moving forward. So if we take our previous example numbers, the 200% increase and the 50% increase, we still add those together at 250%. Then we multiply this percentage by our 30%, which would be a 1.3 time multiplier, resulting in a total damage increase of 325%, or in this case, a 4.25 times multiplier, thus spitting out 425 total damage. Now, there's also a few other things that Bungie's making changes to come Edge of Fate. Number one, melee damage in the Edge of Fate will no longer scale Scorch and Ignition damage. Similar to how Bungie changed Jolt damage scaling a while back. The big nerf on this one, of course, will be Consecration builds, and we're going to touch on that here shortly. Our final notes. Today, we are just working with theoretical numbers, as well as comparisons based on our current sandbox. When the Edge of Fate launches, damage scaling across the entire game will be simplified to display real damage values. So what I'm trying to say is your damage numbers post Edge of Fate are going to look way smaller, and that's because everything is getting squished but normalized across the game. Now, for the sake of simplicity in this video, we're keeping things 1-to-1, meaning we're not actually going to be squishing the damage values down, as we don't really know exactly how squished we're going to be. So if we're saying things like, hey, you're going to be doing 30,500 damage instead of 30,000 damage in the next expansion, understand what we're really trying to display there is the percentage change from base melee to buff melee. Both of those numbers will be substantially squished in Edge of Fate, which takes us to our first class hunters. We have Combination Blow, which is a staple on both Arc and Prismatic. Testing at base melee, we're able to hit Call for 8,685 damage. Then when you use Combination Blow times 3, as well as Liar's Handshake, you throw in Stylus Executioner, Facet of Courage, this pumps that damage up to a whopping 290,100 188, roughly 3,241%, or a 33.41 times multiplier. Now, looking at what to expect coming Edge of Fate, we got Combination Blow ×3, which is being buffed to a 400% increase at max stacks. We've got Liar's Handshake also going up to 400% increase. We got Stylish going up to 300% increase, and Fast of Courage, which will be a 50% increase. And then lastly, we have the 200 melee stat for our only multiplicative 30% increase. Now, all this together actually only gives us a total damage value of 141,131, which is a 1,525% increase, or a 16.25 times multiplier over our base melee. So as you can see from this specific example, overall combination blow builds are getting hit with a pretty substantial nerf. Now, you could potentially throw in either 1-2 punch or Bastion to get a higher number, but the point is that damage value would be more now than it will be in Edge of Fate. And if we included something like Bastion, the gap in damage between where we are now and where we're going to be in Edge of Fate is going to widen. In Edge of Fate, it's going to be an 18.85 times multiplier versus what we currently have, which is a 66.8 times multiplier. Guys, these are pretty substantial. Now, I know like 1-to-1, what Bungie's really trying to say is, hey, a single melee damage buff, that's good. You're great. You're going to be doing a lot of damage here. Hell, maybe even 2. But what you really start to see, and when I throw the comparisons up here, when we start tacking on more buffs to combination blow, is that more buffs being added on has a significant taper off at the end, which is exactly what Bungie's trying to do. They're trying to keep us from running away too far here with our melee damage. At the same time, it sucks, because as someone who loves to run around fisting my enemies, it is going to be noticeable how much less damage I'm doing with certain builds. Now, on the other side of things though, melees for more crowd control purposes, things like weighted throwing knife and threaded spike, actually end up with a buff. For threaded spike at base, we're dealing 19,041 damage. And when we tested with Spirit of Syntheseps, which gave us 50,457 damage, this being that 2.65 times multiplier at 165%, in Edge of Fate, that's going up, because theoretically with Syntheseps and a 200 melee stats, we would be doing 65,691 damage, which is a 3.45 times multiplier at 245% increase in damage. Then with weighted throwing knife at base, we're dealing 33,661. And then if you build using Arthur's Embrace and 1-2 punch, you would deal 201,964 damage, which is a whopping 500% increase over base, or 6 times multiplier. Now, in Edge of Fate, theoretically, with Arthur's increase going to 300% and 1-2 punch increase going to 150%, and our 200 melee stat bonuses, we would actually be doing 240,676 damage, or a 7.15 times multiplier at 615%. Now, something to note when using Arthur's Embrace is that this exotic intrinsically grants plus 50 strength while the buff is active. So in this case, we should only have to invest to 150 in our melee stats, but we would still get the 200 stat from the exotic itself, therefore giving us that multiplier. Something to keep in mind. Now, just taking these examples right here, you're noticing that yes, while things like combination blow look like they're getting absolutely destroyed on the high end of our buffs, you're also seeing a rotation into other melee-based builds that I think many people have never really entertained. Next up, though, a build that we're going to be keeping a close eye on is our Grapple Melee. You see, currently a Grapple Melee by itself does 41,688 damage. Now, if you add a number of things to this build, including Spirit of Syntheseps, Stylish Executioner, 1-2 punch, hell, even Banner of War, which is provided here by an ally, we were hitting 455,234 damage, which is a whopping 992% increase over base, or 10.92 times multiplier. Now, one of the options we calculated was using Combo Blow ×3, Banner of War, Spirit of Syntheseps, and Bastion, as it's now going to a 300% increase. Along with our 200 melee stats, we get a total of 577,379, which is a 1,285% increase, or a 13.85 times multiplier. Now, theoretically, in Edge of Fate, this Grapple Melee combination will be higher than what we are doing currently. Now, where things get really crazy is the fact that Grapple Melee still currently benefits from, get this, grenade damage increases. Now, this doesn't surpass the current melee damage buff options, but as far as we know, grenades will still use a multiplicative system. So unless Bungie changes how grenade buff stacks with Grapple Melees, it could still act as a multiplicative buff, theoretically allowing you to reach some crazy crazy numbers. Well, we've calculated using combination blow times 3, Banner of War, Bastion, 200 melee stat increase, 200 grenade stat increase, and Verity's Brow from an exotic class item. All thrown together, in theory, could give us a damage value of 1,609,573 in Edge of Fate, which is an insane number to think about. We're talking 3,761% increase over our base number. That's a 38.61 times multiplier. In my opinion, there's no way Bungie's gonna let that fly. An increase from 455,000 damage all the way to over 1.6 million from a single grapple melee would be wild. You'll have teams out there trying to grapple melee the witness. Again though, I don't expect this to work come Edge of Fate. We're going to assume it doesn't stack, but we will be keeping an eye on it just in case. Now moving on to our Warlock Melee options. I'm gonna be honest here, guys. Y'all don't have that many melee builds to begin with. You've got Lightning Surge, which at base was hitting for 59,671. And in terms of buffing Lightning Surge, really the best option would be Syntheseps, since this is mainly an ad clearing melee, and one we've definitely utilized in build battles. Now currently in game, this combo deals 154,675 damage, which is a 165% increase in damage, or a 2.65 times multiplier. Now come Edge of Fate, this will receive a buff because 1-2 Punch will now synergize with Lightning Surge. So if you did Spirit of Syntheseps, 1-2 Punch, 200 melee stats, theoretically your damage would be 321,925, giving us a whopping 440% increase in damage at a 5.4 times multiplier. You could potentially even use Bastion with this buff, but keep in mind it is a bit more awkward to hit a target with Bastion rather than just hitting one ad with a shotgun and then using Lightning Surge, but I'm sure some of you are going to figure it out. Now, Warlocks could also potentially build into Incinerator Snaps, but this is an example of something that will be nerfed due to melee damage no longer scaling ignitions. You see, currently at base, we're dealing 59,644 damage. Then with Winter's Guile, we're hitting 223,802 damage, which is a 275% increase in damage at a 3.75 times multiplier. In Edge of Fate, we do have Winter's Guile going up to 400% increase in damage paired with our 200 melee stats, but this still only gives us 188,602 theoretical damage, which is just a 260% increase in damage at a 3.16 times multiplier. I know, man. I miss the days of Mustang. Oh, what a time, right? Now, it's also worth mentioning that Pocket Singularity is getting a buff against non-boss combatants by 20%. And against boss combatants by, get this, 56%, which is what we chose to test against since it's the biggest increase. This has never really been a big damage dealing melee, and there's really not a lot of options to buff this either. Currently at base, it deals a measly 6,278 damage. Then testing with Spirit of the Syntheseps, we were able to deal 16,636 damage for our 165% increase at a 2.65 times multiplier. Now in Edge of Fate, if you take this into account, that 56% increase to our base melee, you take Spirit of Syntheseps, you could use 1-2 Punch, 200 melee stats. This would give us a theoretical damage value of 52,839, which is quite a big jump. I mean, we're talking 742% increase to what Pocket Singularity does at its current form. Personally, I'm not going to be going out of my way to use Pocket Singularity inside of PvE, but if you want to, go right ahead, Warlocks. You guys already throw just by existing. Now, the only other thing really of note on a Warlock you could take advantage of would be Grapple Melee. Again, at base, Grapple Melee does 41,688 damage, and in game, we tested with Banner of War, Bastion, Winter's Guile, and this gave us 437,724 damage, which is a 950% increase over base at a 10.5 times multiplier. Now again, we're going to assume that grenade stacking won't work in Edge of Fate, but even without that, Warlock Grapple Melee would be getting buffed as well. Our calculation when using Banner of War, Bastion, Winter's Guile, and a 200 melee stat ends up at 487,749, which I know is only an 11% increase in damage from our current pre-numbers, but an increase nonetheless. Then finally, we have our true melee class, Titan. Starting off, let's talk about Consecration, which as you probably expected is definitely going to be hurt by the ignition changes. Now, along with the melee increase no longer buffing ignitions in Edge of Fate, Consecration is also losing its 20% bonus damage it does to ignitions, which to be fair, at least in our testing, we didn't find that 20% to always proc anyways. Now at At base, with Consecration, we did a total of 69,447 damage. Then with our current build, we tested using Syntheseps and Knockout, which gave us a total damage of 273,557, which is a 294% increase over base at a 3.94 times multiplier. In Edge of Fate though, using this same combination with 200 melee and taking into account the ignition nerf, we should be doing around 176,449 damage, which is roughly a 154% increase at a 2.54 times multiplier. So you can pretty clearly see here where Consecration falls off. I think it's still going to be good for crowd control and maybe even like a mini boss, perhaps some champions, but it definitely is getting nerfed. And I, for one, am probably going to be looking elsewhere for other melee-based builds. Now, something that does seem like it would be better in Edge of Fate, though, is going to be Bonk. This is one that has definitely fallen off over the years, as at one time, Bonk was everything. It was the original Consecration. Currently at base, though, our throwing hammer is hitting for 28,852. Then using Syntheseps, Roaring Flames times 3, we're able to deal 101,766 damage, with our throwing hammer giving us a 252% increase at a 3.52 times multiplier. In Edge of Fate, a throwing 1-2 punch and a 200 melee stat into the mix, we will be doing around 230,816 damage, which is a 700% increase over a base throwing hammer at an 8 times multiplier. Now the damage numbers look really good here. Hopefully though, the new Titan Exotic, where we can literally recall our hammer back to us, I'm really hoping that that's really going to elevate Bonk and I never have to consider Syntheseps. Now Fletched Storm is another melee option that is arguably one of my favorite aspects in the game, especially with Wishful Ignorance. The animation is so cool, but sadly, it's been pretty underwhelming. At base, with all 5 melee hits, we're dealing 167,940 damage. Now, when we tack on things like Banner of War, Wishful Ignorance, that kicks us up to 322,109 damage, which is around a 92% increase at a 1.92 times multiplier. Now, let me just say, Fletched Storm and Wishful Ignorance is going to be so strong in Edge of Fate. If we were to include this same setup, plus the 200 melee stat, this increases our damage to a whopping 713,912 damage. Guys, that's 325% at a 4.25 times multiplier. I cannot express just how good Wishful Ignorance and Fletched Storm is about to be in this next sandbox. Another popular option for my Titan class is, of course, Peregrine Greaves. Now, in terms of damage against bosses, tormentors, and champions, there is no change there. It'll still be a 1000% increase. But against other enemy types though, it's gonna go from a 363% buff to a 400% buff. So for this testing, we specifically did it against a boss, but we're gonna touch on champions and mini boss numbers as well. Seismic Strike here at base, we're hitting for 25,190 damage. Then stacking Peregrine and Knockout, we're hitting for 138,364, giving us that 449% increase in damage at a 5.49 times multiplier. In Edge of Fate, calculating Peregrine Greaves, knockouts, and a melee stat of 200, we're sitting at 185,260 damage, giving us a 635% increase over base. In terms of mini boss damage, again, it's still going to be that 1000%. For an example, currently, if you were using Seismic Strike along with Peregrine and Knockout together against a mini boss, this would be a 1,550% increase in damage over base, or roughly 16.5 time multiplier. Now, come Edge of Fate, again, we have our 1000% increase against mini bosses with Peregrine, but with Knockout, it's 160% increase, but keep in mind, this is additive. So realistically, if you're looking to get the same damage with the Greave Knockout combo, you're going to need 200 melee for that 30% multiplicative increase. So in Edge of Fate, you're going to be looking somewhere around 1,538% at a 16.38 times multiplier. So yes, you will be doing more damage at 200 melee stats, but it is somewhat close. I think the biggest emphasis here, guys, is like even if you aren't proccing Knockout, because like the Knockout additive buff is kind of whatever. It's that multiplicative 200 stat buff that's going to make all the difference. Across the board though, guys, Greaves is actually looking to get a bit of an upgrade, doing decently more, but nothing too crazy. Now moving on to Hammer Strike. Our base damage was the same as Seismic, dealing 25,190 damage. Currently testing this with Peregrine and Roaring Flames times 3. This gives us 109,356 damage, which is a 334% increase over base at a 4.34 times multiplier. Then calculating for Edge of Fate using Greaves, Roaring Flames times 3, which is getting a massive buff from 73% to 200%, and also is no longer decrease when using Peregrine Greaves. If you calculate that alongside a 200 melee stat, this gives us a theoretical total damage here of 176,834. So roughly a 602% increase in damage at a 7.02 times multiplier. Now, less than Knockout and Greaves, but comparable. Then we have our Shield Bash, which again is the same base of 25,109 damage. Testing currently, if you've got Greaves and Offensive Bulwark, you're able to deal 184,486 damage, giving us a 632% increase over base at a 7.32 times multiplier. Then calculating for Edge of Fate, we've got Greaves, Offensive Bulwark, and a 200 melee stats, and we get a damage value of 185,260, giving us an increase of 635%, or 7.35 times multiplier. Now this one here is pretty much just a sign grade, as it's just going to be dealing less than 1,000 extra damage, but of course this is all taken into account our 200 melee stats. Now if you're trying to maximize damage and use either 1-2 punch or Bastion in Edge of Fate, your shoulder charge damage would be lower than what you could do now. However, in our testing, we found that the timing is really difficult to incorporate. So if you're just using shoulder charge with a few buffs, you should be seeing an increase in Edge of Fate. Now, Shield Throw is also getting a buff come Edge of Fate, but not necessarily to its damage. It's essentially receiving a 77% increase to its projectile tracking, which we'll take. Hell, it needed it, man. Currently at base though, Shield Throw hits Carl for 22,441 damage. Now, there aren't really a lot of things that can buff Shield Throw. Could you use Syntheseps? Sure, but most people that are using Shield Throw are probably rocking Second Chance. So for our pre-testing, we just use Offensive Bulwark, which allows us to do 44,881 damage, which is a 100% increase over base at a 2 times multiplier. Now come Edge of Fate, Shield Throw will work with 1-2 punch. So if you combine that with our 200 melee stats, this could give us a theoretical damage value of 119,611, which is a whopping 433% increase over base at a 5.33 times multiplier. Now, although this doesn't have a lot of buffing options, Captain America build for Edge of Fate is looking pretty hot. Now, the last thing on time we wanted to talk about is our Grapple Melee, which just like with our previous classes, we will be seeing an increase on Titan as well. Again, at base, this does 41,688 damage. When you combine this with Banner of War, Bastion, and even Worm Gods, we can hit for a whopping 437,724, giving us that 950% increase in damage at a 10.5 times multiplier. Come Edge of Fate though, assuming grenade stacking doesn't work here, we'll be doing 487,749, which is a 1,070% increase over its base at 11.7 times multiplier. Now there was one final melee change to discuss, which deserved its own section, and that is for Glaives. Unfortunately, Glaives are getting hit pretty hard, but to help counteract these nerfs, there's also a lot of ease of use buffs happening, which should make damage stacking with Glaives a lot easier and won't give as many penalties as you currently experience. Across the board, they're getting nerfed against all enemy types, that being minors and majors by 40%, champions and mini bosses by 28.5%, and then bosses and vehicles by 50%. Now, since bosses were the biggest nerf for these damage calculations, I wanted to see specifically what we're looking like against Greg instead of Carl here. Because of these decreases, Glaive Melee is now considered an unpowered melee, meaning it can take full advantage of things like Syntheseps, Knockout, Worm God, Combination Blow, and many more things that previously either didn't synergize or couldn't receive the full damage bonus. Now, due to this change, Glaives will no longer benefit from the weapon damage bonuses such as Radiance, Well of Radiance, Lumina, etc. Now, getting into our Glaive numbers now, at base, a single Glaive Melee does 11,644 against our boss that we tested on. Now, for our damage stacking test in-game currently, on all classes, we tested out the same combination of either Winter Bite or a legendary Glaive with close to melee, along with Banner of War, Syntheseps, and Well of Radiance. Currently with Winter Bite, we are dealing 54,580 damage, which is a 369% increase over base at a 4.69 times multiplier. And then with close to melee instead of Winter Bite, on this legendary Glaive, we're able to deal 47,303 damage, which is a 306% increase. Now, something to keep in mind is that Glaives also have that combo now. It's a beautiful change Bungie added in Heresy, where the third hit does increased damage. Now, we're not going to factor that into our calculations here, since we're just really focusing on the single hit damage, and you can of course carry on those percentages to that third hit. Now, the reason why we chose to do our numbers based on boss damage is because the 50% decrease against bosses is the biggest Glaive nerf. And on top of that, Winter Bite's damage increase when your magazine is full is being reduced from a 50% increase against bosses to only a 20% increase. Keep in mind, at one time, Winter Bite could shred bosses. I loved using Winter Bite to go in there and poke enemies and bosses to death. Now, this is going to result in a huge nerf to Glaive damage against bosses, but especially to Winter Bite. Now, our ideal melee build on Hunter now with various buffs and new stacking capabilities would be Combination Blow ×3, Banner of War, Trident Vice, and then we could take into account the Winter Bite nerf. The overall Glaive nerf and our melee 200 stat damage bonus would give us a damage value of 62,063, which is a 433% increase in damage over our base melee at a 5.33 times multiplier. Now, close to melee, which is a Glaive perk, is another melee option that is getting a buff, going from 30% to 60%. And get this, we'll actually end up doing more damage than Winter Bite. With that same setup, but on a normal legendary close to melee Glaive, we would be doing 65,090 damage, which in this case is a 459% increase at a 5.59 times multiplier. Now, no lie, Winter Bite looks rough. I mean, bad. There ain't no way Bungie is about to ship this thing and allow it to do less damage than a legendary Glaive that's not even in the heavy slots. It's being speculated that just maybe Winter Bite's increased damage when the magazine is full might be a multiplicative buff instead of an additive buff, which it desperately needs. But even if we roll those numbers forward, we're sitting at 72,659 damage. To be honest with you guys, that still is not worth it. We'll be running the numbers post, but to me, Winter Bite is dead. Now, if we take a look at our other classes on Warlock, our ideal setup would be our close to melee Glaive, Banner of War, Syntheseps, and then taking into account the Glaive nerf, but a 200 stat increase. This would give us 32,137 damage, which is only a 176% increase over base at a 2.76 times multiplier. Now, if we took Winter Bite in this case, and again, if it happens to be multiplicative, we're still only looking at 33,185 damage. So for my Warlocks, Glaive builds are no bueno. Then finally, we have our Titans. Ideally, you would want to use a close to melee Glaive and Worm Gods since they won't be reduced with Glaives anymore. Now, if you slap on Banner of War and Offensive Bulwark, which I know requires some hoops to jump through, but we're just trying to tack on a lot of different stacking buffs here. Then, if you take into account the Glaive nerf, but our 200 melee stats, this actually cranks our damage to 62,063, which is a 433% increase. And then again, in the event Winter Bite's melee damage is actually multiplicative, that would instead give us 69,049 damage, so a 493% increase. Keep in mind though, guys, here we're showing you like the highest point of all the stacking damage buffs. At the end of the day, what's really feasible? I think that's very important to keep in mind. I definitely wanted to show you on the highest end of the spectrum what you'll be able to get your damage buffs up to, but at the same time, in the heat of battle, it's important to note what your build could pull off consistently. I think the biggest takeaway from all this though is that legendary Glaives, especially if you're using close to melee, are going to be the way to go in terms of Glaive melee builds. Winter Bite is doing more damage, but at the same time, it's doing less damage than legendary Glaives. And this is just one of those things we're gonna have to look at pre and post because I'm kind of just scratching my head. Winter Bite, of course, is being speculated to be a multiplicative buff with its perk active rather than additive, but this is just something we're only speculating and we won't know until Edge of Fate or even maybe if Bungie gives us clarification from now until next week. What I will say though is Hunters, you guys are looking pretty good with Trident Vice. And in my opinion, I think Hunters are actually going to be more of the Glaive class moving forward. Titans using Worm Gods aren't that far behind either. Syntheseps does have the ease of use, but definitely doesn't have the damage that Worm Gods has. Now, to sum up all of the changes that we've discussed today, the short answer is that builds which previously had a lot of different buffs going on, such as Combination Blow on Hunters or things that rely on buffing ignition, such as Concentration builds, will be worse in Edge of Fate. More neutral game builds, such as Bonk Hammer, Lightning Surge, Weighted Throwing Knife, Threaded Spike, and especially Fletched Storm, will be doing a lot better in the Edge of Fate. And then pretty much across the board on all three classes, Grapple Melee builds will be doing better in the Edge of Fate compared to what they do now. And if Bungie does allow for grenade stacking to continue for our Grapple Melees, and it happens to be multiplicative, then Grapple Melee is going to absolutely break the game. Again, we don't think that's going to happen, but we'll definitely be testing just to see. Overall, I do hate seeing things get nerfed. At the same time, I look at Fletched Storm and Wishful Ignorance, and my mouth waters. I can't wait to give those builds a go. But I think what testing the numbers really showed me is that investing into a 200 stat is going to be a necessity. As much as I'm sitting there going, oh, 30% multiplicative bonus, heck yeah. Many of our builds are going to need that 30% in order to bring it up to parity to what we have currently in the game, with of course some outliers greatly exceeding that. And as we get into Edge of Fate, whether it's a grenade-based build, a strength-based build, hell, a weapons-based build, the point is that you're going to have dedicated builds with a major emphasis on investing your stat points to really get the most out of your builds. So that's it, guys. That is our melee breakdown. are theoretical numbers. We got some nerfs, we got some buffs. You see some of the outliers already, so feel free to build into that accordingly right now. We've got 3 videos coming out this week, 1 for each class. It's going to go over some builds we highly recommend going into Edge of Fate, so be looking out for those. Fellas and ladies, thank you all for coming and watching, and as always,
Slap that like button like your mama told you right.